So good evening, everyone, and good morning if you're calling in from overseas. Welcome to the Australian Circular Economy Hub's very first evening event. We're quite excited. Thank you for joining us. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're all calling from today, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'm joining from the land of the Yugambeh language people on the Gold Coast, and I welcome you to share your location with us in the chat. So my name is Dr. Nicole Garofano, and I am the head of Circular Economy Development at Planet Ark with the Australian Circular Economy Hub. The ACE Hub is funded by the Australian Government and our sponsors Bingo Industries, Keep Cup and Planet Ark Power. And our mission is to facilitate the transition to a circular economy in Australia by providing a knowledge sharing platform and by encouraging collaboration. And certainly this evening's event is addressing both of those, so we hope you enjoy it. A quick bit of housekeeping before we move forward. So this event is being recorded and will be available to watch and also share with those who can't be with us tonight. From our website. It'll be on there by the end of the week, so look out for that. You'll also receive an email with that information as well. And if you can select gallery view from the top right hand on your screen so you can see everyone, all of the panelists, that would be great. We have allocated 15 minutes for questions from the audience at the end of the session. So if you could really use the Q&A box for those questions rather than the chat, the general chat. And in that Q&A box, you can use your thumbs up to upvote which questions you feel might be more pertinent or might be more priority to look at as we come to the second half of our session today. So as we know, we're talking today about the opportunity for circular economy to address the issues of climate change. And we are at a critical juncture. Global commitments to tackle climate change are again in the spotlight as delegates prepare for the 26th Conference of the Parties for the 196 countries plus the European Union that have agreed to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And what we know more commonly and is in the press currently as COP26 will take place in Glasgow between the 31st of October and the 12th of November, so literally just next week. Collectively, tens of thousands of negotiators, government representatives, businesses and citizens will contribute to these 12 days of talks and hopefully contribute to the action plans as well. Under the Paris Agreement of 2015, member countries committed to control the emissions to limit global warming to a preferred 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, these countries agreed to bring forward national plans setting out how much they would like to reduce or how much they would intend to reduce their emissions in what are known as nationally determined contributions or NDCs. Members agreed that every 5 years they would come back with an updated plan that would reflect their highest possible ambition to achieve this goal. And this is the year in Glasgow where they present their progress. And there's a real expectation of ambitious emissions reductions targets by 2030 that can deliver this net zero outcome by 2050. On the agenda is the acceleration for the phasing out of coal-fired power and to encourage an investment in renewables. And it's not just the major economies, but to mobilise financing for developing economies to achieve a global investment that can contribute to delivering this net zero target. And it's clear that energy targets are on the agenda, but is a focus just on energy enough? And what if there was another situation that's right in front of us? And that's what we're going to be talking about this evening. What is not for debate, though, is that climate action has actually never been more urgent. We only have one planet and not the 3 planets that might be necessary if we all continue to on the current consumption track that we have at consumption at all costs. And as the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres confirmed, it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, oceans and land. So in today's discussion, we will explore how our nations can contribute to emissions reductions and address warming by transitioning to a circular economy. We'll look at the latest circular economy and climate research, learning the drivers of change and identify hopes for this year's COP26 conference. And also how vital a role the circular economy can play in the creation of a resilient net zero future And that's going to be sooner rather than later, where we can. So taking on the mammoth task, 3 leading experts in the circular economy and climate change fields. And we are extremely fortunate to have our panelists joining us for this event. And I'll now introduce each one before we get started. So first up, joining us from the Netherlands for his morning, don't you just love technology that we can join with Jelmer, is Jelmer Hoogzaad. Jelmer is a climate change mitigation and circular economy expert. He is the co-author of the annual Global Circularity Gap Report and has conducted metabolic analysis for the governments of Laos, Vanuatu, the Gambia, the Dutch province of North Holland, the city of Almaty in Kazakhstan, and the private sector. Jelmer's systems or metabolic analysis, supported with detailed data visualizations, places a company or a jurisdiction in a broader system of material flows and stocks, thereby allowing decision makers to really develop a joint vision of a circular, low carbon economy and defining their own role in the transition towards that future. Before I go on, I'm just going to close my window to the crows that seem to be loving the noise outside. My apologies. Next, we have New South Wales Circular CEO, Lisa McLean. Lisa is a circular economy and zero carbon business transformation leader. She has been successfully advising industry and governments in developing new policy frameworks and regulations that bring about market change to enable the circular zero carbon economy over the last 14 years. This work has covered the energy, water, waste, and mobility sectors, both in the UK and in Australia. As I mentioned, Lisa is the CEO of New South Wales Circular, a government-funded circular economy innovation body, leading the transition to a zero carbon circular economy for New South Wales and for Australia. Starting her career as a political journalist working in the National Press Gallery, she then moved to advising ministers and premiers before heading to the UK to help establish the Clinton Climate Initiative. Fantastic. Our third panelist is Professor Thomas Wiedmann, or Tommy Wiedmann. Tommy is the Professor of Sustainability Research and is leading the Sustainability Assessment Program at UNSW in Sydney, Australia. In teaching and research, Tommy is guided by the question on how to achieve concurrent human and planetary well-being. Tommy has long-standing expertise in integrated quantitative sustainability assessment, industrial ecology, and environmental footprint analysis. His recent research is focusing on the relationship between sustainability, transformations, and planetary boundaries. Tommy is also an adjunct science leader at the CSIRO here in Australia and is a lead author on the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC report. In 2012, he received the Thomson Reuters Citation Award in Australia and has been listed as highly cited researcher since 2015. And Tommy is also a member of our Circular Economy Metrics Working Group. So it's wonderful, very exciting to have all of you joining us today. Thank you so much for giving us your time. We're really excited to get into the discussion. I should just flag for the audience as well that this will be a discussion. We're not going to be using slides this afternoon. It's very much an interactive session between the panelists. And what we're going to be focusing on are 3 main areas. So first, we'll discuss climate change and just give us a bit of a refresher on what are the current points we need to be concerned with. Then we'll understand how the circular economy can address climate change. And lastly, we'll then discuss how these points are in the context of Australia. And this will be followed by our discussion at the end. So let's get started. And Tommy, if we'd like to hear from you first, and if you could speak to your findings from the IPCC report, why do you think we need to have such urgent climate action?
Yeah, thank you very much, Nicole, and welcome everyone. Good evening. So the IPCC, as you said, is publishing currently the 6th assessment report. So these are the reports that come out every 5 years or so, very thick, thousands of pages summarizing all the evidence that science knows about climate change. The first part has been published in August, which was about the physical science of climate change. And the second part, which will be about impacts, and the third part about mitigation will be published next year, early next year. So unfortunately, after COP26. But what it says is not really so much new, but what has changed really is that the evidence now for climate change is much stronger and the language is much more assertive. You have already mentioned, Nicole, that it says now that it is unequivocal that humans have caused climate change. So that question is once and for all off the table, hopefully. But also it says that the unprecedented recent changes in extreme weather events are very much linked to climate change. So there's much more evidence now that those extreme events, and we've seen the floods in Europe and in China, we have seen the heat events in North America, we have seen the bushfires here in Australia, of course, but also in Siberia, that these events are so much clearer linked to climate change than we thought before. Actually, there is recent research that has said that some of those events, for example, the heat dome event in Western North America and the wildfires in Siberia would not have happened if there hadn't been climate change. So that's very, very strong, and it's as clear as it can be. It also underlines the urgency. That's where this is coming from. The climate change impacts are here, they're happening now, and they're actually worse than what was predicted even only a few years ago. The other part is what you also alluded already to, that greenhouse gas emissions are still rising. So up to 2019, we have reached the highest level of greenhouse gas emissions just before the COVID crisis of 59 gigatons of CO2 equivalents that we ever had. Then, of course, that dropped because of COVID-19, but now we are more or less back to that high level already, even though the pandemic is not even over yet completely. We are not on track to achieve the aims of the Paris Agreement to keep global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. Current pledges will lead us to something between 2.4 and 2.7 degrees Celsius of warming. So current pledges that governments take to COP26 are not enough yet. What does that mean for Australia? Global warming currently is at 1.1 degrees Celsius compared to mid-20th century's levels. But Australia has already warmed by 1.4 degrees Celsius. So Australia is actually a hotspot of warming, is warming above global average. And if we are really not reaching the Paris Agreement goals, then Australia is headed for something like 3 degrees of warming. And this is unfortunately a very hard to imagine situation. I mean, we are literally running out of words here because the extreme weather events that led to the Black Summer bushfires, they were not severe, they were not extreme, they were deemed catastrophic. It was the first time that this fire danger rating had to be applied. It was only introduced shortly before. The first time we had to apply catastrophic rating. What we are in store for, if we are not reaching the Paris Agreement goals, is beyond catastrophic. I don't know what the word would be, uninhabitable, unimaginable, I don't know. And frankly, it's frightening to go there, but it just underlines, the urgency. It shows how big the challenge is. And I know that this is a bleak picture, but I think it's good to know this, to put it in context in, what do we need to achieve in what time frame? What can circular economy help us here? I think it's good to have that as a background.
It is, and it is a bit grim, but hopefully by the end of our session today, people will be coming away with some opportunities for contributions through the circular economy. So thank you, Tommy, for setting that context for us. We've seen that the UNEP's 2020 emissions gap report did find that, as you mentioned, that if all the national climate pledges are fulfilled, that we're still on track to reach that 3.2 degrees. So Jelmer, I'm wondering from your perspective, what needs to change in order for us to try and keep it at that lower level based on your experience?
I think essentially what needs to change is that we need to consider the whole picture. So when looking at just sort of conventional approaches to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, whether it's sort of policies from governments or strategies from companies, the focus has been very much on the actual sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's important, but it doesn't take into consideration the whole picture. And let me give you an example. When I was back in 2003, I was in Kazakhstan working on a chrome smelter, which was built there in 1943, and it would be completely replaced with a state-of-the-art facility. So the emissions per ton chrome would go down dramatically, which is good. But of course, and that was something that I stumbled over when working on other projects as well, is that with that investment, also the capacity would increase around 3 times. So in absolute terms, we saw again an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. And that became sort of something I came across with nearly every project I did. And then I realized this, just looking at these facilities alone is not enough. We also need to understand, why do we need so much chrome, or whatever product we're producing? Can we do it less perhaps? And that's the question that the circular economy, I think, in a nice way tries to address. Just as an example, if you look at cement production, we could focus on making cement kilns more efficient, but what we don't do yet as much, and also what the current NDCs don't do, is they don't look at low carbon alternatives for cement as a construction material. And that's these are the kind of measures that we need to bring into perspective, because current NDCs primarily focus, so current sort of say Paris pledges really focus on renewable energy, energy efficiency, perhaps a bit of deforestation and reducing methane emissions, but they don't take a full value chain or let alone a systemic perspective. And I think that's what we need to do.
Yeah, so making things efficient is great, but not if you're just replacing that with more consumption or more production. Yeah, great point. And Lisa, what do you think about, if we don't take some drastic actions, what's at stake for Australia in what you've seen in your work?
Look, I think Tommy's really described the reality, and I think this is why we've had great progress in the last couple of days with the National Farmers Federation and now the Prime Minister embracing a transition to zero carbon. This is really important. I think the reality of particularly around food production and, the impacts of our farmers who have, incredible history here with our Indigenous, communities in facing the extreme temperatures, facing the fragility of our environment in Australia. We've got a lot to think about here. As you mentioned, there is a huge weight on our shoulders with this impact and the reality and the facts, and it's really important for us to accept the science on this and then understand the huge opportunity. We know that circular economy, it's important for us to start talking about this. These are, almost half the hidden emissions for us to get to zero carbon, and particularly for our own government, big opportunities here. They're looking for carbon reductions. If we can start to look at those waste streams and food, the way we use food and products, produce them and use them and dispose of them, there's a big opportunity for carbon reductions here. And also embracing circular economy, regenerative principles in the way that we can farm to extract more value, really big opportunities. So I think that, and I want to say that circular economy isn't just about managing our waste, right? It's about a systems transition right across government. So it's how we manage our water systems. At the moment, just in Sydney, where I am, we're flushing away 1.8 Sydney harbours of water every year. Now that's water that just gets used once from dams and out it goes. And there's a phenomenal opportunity to start keeping water locally, embracing innovations, putting downward pressure on costs and utility costs by recycling our water locally. Cars, do we actually need to own that second car? Or if we're near public transport, do we need to own even a car? We measure the health of our economy by how many cars we sell, and cars can cost us about $8,000 a year to own and run. If we look at shared mobility, sometimes the equivalent use of that transport mode can be $2,000. So quite substantial savings here, and big opportunities for us to look at new measures to measure the health of our economy. So it really isn't just about waste. Waste is critically important. And to know that all of us sitting here with this big issue that Tommy has and Jelmer have framed for us, we've all got a role to play here, Nicole. I mean, we can change and influence through our own consumption. We can be cutting carbon. So I think it's quite empowering. Knowledge is empowering, and there are a lot of solutions. And we're at this juncture now where our economy is transforming. The digital transformation is making innovations really accessible and agile, and alternatives. Like, for example, we don't need to be buying our clothes. We can get fashion as a service and other things like this. So from where I'm sitting and where our members are coming from, it is a very positive change of gear for our economy. It's a big rethink, and we do need a lot of change, but big opportunities here.
That's great. Thanks, Lisa. And I think also, just to sort of round out this initial section here, Tommy, what sort of ambitious commitments do you think we need to be seeing at COP26?
Yeah, so as Lisa said, the good news today actually is that our Prime Minister committed to a net zero target by 2050. Science clearly says that we also need to set shorter term targets because it is important how quickly we can reduce our emissions. So net zero by 2050 is good, and it's sort of like the long-term game, but it's also important that we reduce significantly and rapidly before that in the next decade, really, because that determines the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we put into the atmosphere. There's another aspect to that, and that is that developed countries can be seen, or are being seen, as having a higher responsibility because of historic emissions, and also because of their ability to move ahead more quickly than developing countries. So that's why ideally developed countries should set very ambitious 2030 emission reductions that are larger than 50% reductions by 2030. And some countries have done that. And we might see more coming up at COP26. So hopefully there is a momentum there. I just wanted to quickly comment on what Jelmer said about, what's happening in one factory, the rebound effect, that when we become more efficient, that we produce more. That's exactly what we're seeing at the global level as well. So that will be part of the upcoming part 3 of the IPCC report that has looked at the overall global picture. And it's very much the same. We had efficiency gains of about 2% per year over the last 30 years. So we have really done well at becoming more energy and carbon efficient, but that was completely overwritten by economic growth. Economic growth was 2% per year. Public population as well, 1% per year. So not as strong, but both together, in particular economic growth, have completely negated and those efficiency gains. So there's a rebound effect at the global level, at the country level, even at the individual household level, and we really have to deal with that. So I couldn't agree more with what Lisa said. We have to think about transformational change, system change, rather than incremental. That's very important. Circular economy can certainly help with this if we get this right. So the framing for this is really strong. And then we can get beyond this. So if we can get to a situation where we have an absolute reduction of our total material throughput in the economy, and greenhouse gas emissions as well, of course, then we can achieve that, but we have to think transformational rather than incremental.
Yeah, important. Wonderful. Thanks, Tommy. So I guess moving on to the section that we're talking specifically around how the circular economy can contribute to climate change. Jelmer, as one of the lead authors for the Circularity Gap Report, can you explain this connection between circularity and climate change?
Well, I think to understand that connection, it's important to realize that our global carbon footprint only to a certain extent comes from energy. And I'm not referring to energy use in general, but energy as really a final product. So if you look at consumers, end users, and the extent to which they use energy as a final product, it only relates to sort of passenger transport, heating and cooling our buildings, perhaps a bit lighting, but that's mostly it. The rest of our sort of carbon footprint is related to stuff we use, to products, materials, and that's That part is around 67% of the global carbon footprint, and around, say, the remaining 1/3 is related to the energy we use. When it comes to materials, all these materials come clearly with their carbon footprint, and that's where the circular economy has a role to play. And that's together with the Dutch NGO Circular Economy. Just last year, we finally had the ability to really calculate this through. If we deploy all these circular economy strategies that we know of, how far do we get in terms of reducing global greenhouse gas emissions? And there were, I think, two interesting conclusions. One, the very positive conclusion was that we can close the gap. So you refer to the UNEP, sort of annually updated UNEP emissions gap, where they calculate, right, if all the NDCs are successfully implemented, which is already an assumption, I have to say, then there's still a gap remaining to a 1.5 degree scenario. That gap we can close with circular economy strategies, because the circular economy can close global greenhouse or reduce global greenhouse gas emissions with around 39%, was our estimate. What I think was also an interesting conclusion, a bit on the side, is that we also know from previous global circularity gap reports that our material consumption globally is only around 9% circular. The remaining 91% are linear material flows. Like Lisa sort of pointed out, water simply is harvested and disposed of, clearly linear flow. And greenhouse gas emissions, I think, are another good example of that. If we deploy all these circular economy strategies to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, we are actually only closing the circularity gap up to 17%. In other words, we don't have to intervene that much in our material flows to actually be very effective on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the reason for that is that when we look at really the bulk of the materials that we use, so when we talk about the circularity gap, many of them have a very low carbon footprint. That's around construction materials, sand, gravel, really the bulk we use to particularly build up infrastructure in, say, low or medium income countries. So in terms of progress on circularity, we really don't need that much to actually close the gap on our greenhouse gas emissions. I think there was another interesting conclusion that came out.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Jelmer. That's really, yeah, it's such an important component, isn't it? That there is so much focus on energy, but yet we do have this, you know, the consumption element of it is really where we can make some really significant shifts. And so from your perspective, Lisa, what do you think needs to happen for the circular economy to assist, you know, the governments that you're working with there in New South Wales, government departments, companies, cities, you know, other organisations to help address climate change and potentially meet the SDGs as well through adopting circular economy?
Well, look, I think it's just firstly understanding that circular economy can cut carbon. And I think this is quite a revelation. And you know, thank you, Jelmer, and others who've been working in this space, because I think, you know, this is really critical, and it's very empowering, not just for governments who are obviously committed. A lot of the, you know, most of our states have been committed to to zero carbon outcomes. So for them to actually find that there's new levers they can pull to cut more carbon is terrific. But of course, you know, if we understand that the circular economy is, and from our perspective, the circular economy is the new economy, you know, we actually don't have another economic framework that can grow our economies, grow our jobs, grow investment and new industries in a resource-constrained zero carbon future. So circular economy is way more than just, you know, it's important contributor to reducing carbon, but it also creates this new mechanism to grow jobs. And I think this is really important. We know that circular businesses can be highly profitable often because they're taking resource streams, which they get paid to take away, to then turn into new resources and new products and services. So big opportunities to grow jobs. And, you know, New South Wales Circular was very proud to launch our hospital plastics recycling program. You know, it's just a tiny tip of the iceberg where we worked with St Vincent's, we worked with a manufacturer in regional New South Wales and UNSW to capture needle caps and ampules from hospitals. And of course, we're using a lot of those right at the moment with COVID. Clean stream collection with the enthusiastic support of a nurse. He was leading this charge at St Vincent's. We're able to give those waste streams to a manufacturer who could turn them into wheels for roller doors and wind farm components. Now, the savings, if we can scale that, the savings to hospitals can drive enough savings to hire, say, 40 new nurses. And there's also flow-on effects to create another 30 jobs in manufacturing. So this is really, really important, because I think as we change gear in our economy through the decades, it always happens around the world, we're shifting from industry to new industry. We're losing jobs, but we need to know where those new jobs are. And so I think there's a big, important piece here about how we connect the circular economy to jobs and investment, how we both enable and open our markets to new sharing and reuse business models, because they're quite different, aren't they? I mean, look, if I could get my hands on a service that can give me my washing machine and dryer as a service so that I don't have to throw it out. At the moment, my dishwasher's broken and I've just been told it's going to cost more to fix it than buy a new one. And of course, this is what we're facing all the time. So imagine if we can get industry and government to promote markets to allow new service suppliers coming in. And then if our councils working with government and the federal government and state governments can provide more services to collect clean stream waste streams, we'd all be loving it, wouldn't we? Because we don't want to be putting food waste in with bathroom waste, with plastic and textiles and old clothes. No one wants to live like that. So I think big opportunities here to transition. And I think that, it's just really important that governments do focus on opening the markets, also focusing on new circular supply chains, like that example I gave you in the hospitals. At the moment, companies don't even know that they've got a resource in a waste stream. So we've got to help and show them that organisations like New South Wales Circular and others, the work that Planet Ark's doing and our partners around Australia and other government agencies, how can we find and aggregate that data and show the market where that opportunity is to get those resources so that we don't have to take virgin resources. We can replace them with recycled plastic or textiles and other things.
Yeah, great examples. And I love, personally, being a plastics researcher, love that project that you've done with St. Vincent's. Tommy, a quick word from you. I know that you're not a circular economy specialist per se, but you do have the opportunity to address some of the mitigation actions that have been recognised in the IPCC report. So some of those no doubt resonate with what we're talking about here, with some of the actions to address the circular economy. So do you have any sort of snippets from some of those mitigation actions that you see that might sort of flow over into the circular economy discussion?
Yes, absolutely. There is a strong link there. So if you look at the emissions profile, as Jelmer said, global emissions, 1/3 of those are from energy. But an industry is following that on second place, about 1/4 of all the direct emissions. But if you allocate those emissions from electricity and heat that are used in industry to the industry sector, then the industry sector becomes the single largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, what is industry? Industry is the production of basic materials, construction minerals, manufactured products, starting with cement, steel, aluminium, chemicals, wood, paper, plastics, fertilizer, and so on and so on. And for each and all of these materials, you can think of circular economy strategies. And that's not just recycling. That's also how can you deliver a service with less of that material, or maybe without that material, how can you replace that? So everything that's done in this industry sector is related to circular economy, and it has a very big chunk of global emissions. There are unexploited potentials and opportunities for circular economy. We know what can be done, but there are practical limits. So prolonging the lifetime and the circularity of products, of buildings, of infrastructure. We can change construction methods. We can, but we also have to adapt the building codes to go with this, because we know technically many things are possible. We can replace traditional cement and concrete with geopolymer or other types of concrete, but the buildings codes, the standards need to allow this, to do this.
Yeah,
we also need to think about, patterns of urbanization and infrastructure development. All of this is playing into that. zero carbon feedstocks for the production of steel and aluminium, for example. That's where green hydrogen can come in. So there's a lot that can be done, but I agree that we also need to look at those practical barriers, that we need to look at supply chains, how that can be enabled, because technically we can do a lot, but in practice there are obstacles here.
Yeah, thanks, Tommy. And I think in your work, Jelmer, you often, I mean, you've given some examples already around this sort of these cross-sector solutions, you know, connecting these sort of mitigation actions to the circular economy. How important is that from what you've seen in your work, connecting the sectors?
I think in general, in the circular economy, collaboration along a value chain is extremely important. I think Lisa already mentioned the example of products that you would no longer repair but just replace because it financially doesn't work out. That's also related to the cost of labor. But it also prompts us to look at different business models, which in some sectors are very common. In aviation, airlines pay for the jet engines per hour that are being used, and that allows the supplier of that engine to build an engine that lasts as long as possible and is as reliable as possible. Same with the tires. You pay per landing and takeoff, which also allows the tire manufacturer to build a tire that lasts very long, rather than one that would not last that very long, so they can sell one again and again and again. So that's the difference between a service model and a sales model, and I think that's also when it comes to collaboration and the interaction between, say, the producer and the consumer, there are a lot of opportunities there, also in sort of vehicle sharing and different mobility, business models on mobility. Another example, I think, is when, also referring to earlier work by Planet Arc, the Make It Wood campaign, which really looked at the benefits of using wood as a construction material. And just to point that out, when you use wood as a construction material, you first of all have carbon stored in your plantation. You harvest once in a while, but there's an average, a lot of carbon being stored. The wood that you harvest, you actually store in the built environment for a longer period of time. So again, you store carbon. That's about sequestration, but you also avoid emissions in the industries that Thomas just referred to, the cement industry, the steel industry. So it works along a lot of different sectors, but it also requires sectors to collaborate. And there are barriers, legal barriers. Building codes need to allow that. Technically, it's possible. We can build high-rise buildings with wood, no problem. It's lighter, which solves some of the issues of conventional construction materials anyway. But yeah, we need to adjust the legislative framework to make that work. And I think there's maybe as a final point in terms of COP26, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is also about international collaboration, and particularly for a so-called shift country like Australia with a high material footprint, it's extremely important that we work along these value chains, also when they reach into other countries.
Just a quick summary on what that term means, Jelmer. What is a shift economy?
A shift economy is, well, in the GAP report, we distinguished 3 groups of countries. There's build, grow, and shift countries. And they're typically characterized, well, a shift country by a very high material and carbon footprint, typically. These are, say, the high income countries. But there's also an angle of, well, the infrastructure has mostly been built up. The car fleets are mostly saturated. It's not that there's a growing car fleet. So there's a certain degree of saturation in the buildup of materials. In grow countries, that's different. You see rapid growth of cities, infrastructure, vehicles, fleets. So there's a lot of stock being built up, so to say. And stock is sort of the static amount of materials that is in the economy. And then the final category are the grow countries. These are the ones that are really in an earlier stage of building up their stock and growth phase. And there's typical issues also with just basic human needs, which are not met. And these 3 different categories have different sort of decarbonization and circular economy pathways out of them.
Fantastic. Thanks for explaining that. And I guess if people are interested, they could always drop into the Circularity Gap Report to learn some more about those terms. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yes.
So I think we'll move on to what this means to Australia. We suggested a little earlier on what this means for the Australian context, but for, I guess, for Lisa and Tommy, you know, you're both here in Australia. What are some of these learnings around circular economy, climate change? How can they be applied to this Australian context? What are some standout, you know, things that we should be looking for or looking to address? Lisa?
Well, there's a lot of change that's needed. And I think, look, I noticed in the question and chat box that there's some questions around about actually what our products are made of, you know, what's those toxic things. And so I think we've talked a lot about the 3 R's: recycling, reuse, repair. I think there's another one, which is refuse. What are the things that we're actually going to design out of our economy that have got no future? And we know that's with PFAS and PVC, and there's a whole range of components that are in products that consumers don't even know about. We don't know what their impacts are. The general public don't know what their impacts are. So it's a bit of a wild frontier. And I think there's a big piece of work that needs to happen. And that's got to be done shoulder to shoulder with researchers and standards to understand, well, what are those materials that are actually going to go into the economy over and over again to create those jobs that we need to grow our economy, and what are those components that are going to be designed out, and how do we sort of do that? It's complex. You know, some of the work that we're starting to see from the private sector is how we use blockchain, how we use sensors to track the flows of waste streams, and how we can be sure that they're going to be recycled, and how we can be sure that they're going to be disposed of in the right way. So I think smart technology is going to play a big role in this. It already is. And governments will be looking to particularly tackle toxic waste, because in illegal dumping, which, by the way, is becoming more and more prevalent, it's harder to catch. And it's a really big problem as we start to, you know, really value our waste streams. And we, you know, if every waste is a resource, that means that we want to be watching it really carefully and looking for those opportunities. And I think also the other piece, and I've alluded to it before, talking about growing jobs in the economy, but we are going to need an army of new workforce to be doing these jobs, repairing work. You know, if we are going to be starting to repair our components, and we're seeing Philips globally taking back their washing machines, having them as a service so that if they break, they go back. You know, we know with solar panels, for example, there's really valuable silver and silicon and other things in them. At the moment in Australia, they're largely landfilled, and there's some exciting new circular supply chain programs to recycle them. But getting that, extracting that value creates jobs, because we'll need to create new expertise in how to safely deconstruct or decommission these components, whether they're solar panels or whatever else. So building that workforce that can go alongside these new industries is really important, Nicole.
And I think that's a really important point, because, you know, if we think about how much the world has changed, even in the last sort of 20 or 30 years, there were many jobs that we didn't even know existed back then. And I feel like there's going to be a similar type of transition where there are, you know, jobs in the future that we don't know, particularly when we're transitioning to the circular economy. So there's a lot of opportunity there. And Tommy, what about you? What do you think? What are sort of some standout policies or projects that you've seen elsewhere that might be useful in Australia?
Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, Australia really has to learn how to create value from a different type of economy. Obviously, Australia's economic success over the many decades has been coming from material extraction, and that's still going on today. So we know that this cannot go on forever, that we will have to transition to some other form of value creation. And as Lisa rightly says, there's a lot of value that can be created, and jobs along the way, of course, by just dealing with production and consumption in a different way, and seeing how to create value out of that. I mean, we have been forced to deal with our own waste. We cannot, you know, ship it now to China anymore. That's not possible anymore. So we have to think about new ways to do that. And sometimes it's good if there is such an maybe external or internal force that forces us to do things differently. They will not come on their own. I think at least new business models will be required, but there will also have to be, I think, some regulation We need to make the producer more responsible for their products, because otherwise businesses that take on that challenge of, looking after their product, repairing the product, providing a service, they might still be outcompeted by those who just take, make, and dispose, because it's cheaper. So we have to internalize external costs. We have to internalize pollution and waste. And that, there's different ways of doing that. It doesn't have to be a tax. It can be a tax, but it can also be done in other ways. But there has to be help to come to that position. And then, yes, then we can create more value. There's a big focus in Australia on technology, and technology alone will not cut it. But if technology, then we have to think transformational again, rather than end of pipe. So in the case of Australia, one example would be really transitioning away from fossil fuels, green hydrogen, rather than coal and carbon capture and storage, for example. That would be one example, because the latter one would really just perpetuate our extractive economy, and that's not sustainable in the long run.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tommy, for your thoughts. And I guess for all of you as well, I mean, we often see that there's a sort of a top-down, we need to have, national policies, which of course is what, we're talking about at the COP level. But what about if you're a smaller business or, a smaller organization? Jelmer, maybe in some of the work that you've done in other countries, what are some of the actions, I guess, that some businesses can take to really support this transition, noting that they can also contribute to a reduction in climate impacts?
I think for smaller business, there's the whole range of interventions that a circular economy proposes. So they will have to look at new business models. Can I offer my product would sale not be the main point of revenue, but simply a service where you have a retainer fee by the user.
Yeah.
I think that also allows you to invest more in that product, make it a product that lasts. You can make it a more durable product. And I think what's interesting around these kind of concepts is that they intervene at the sort of the latter half of the value chain. And since around 62% of global emissions are around extraction, processing materials, and producing products, if we're able to cycle them here and extend the lifetime, we can cut out the 62%. Then for small businesses, also in sort of more low-income countries, there's a lot of interesting initiatives around also using sort of informal workforces to improve recycling. And I think that also refers to what Lisa said earlier. The circular economy, in essence, is also about transitioning away from a sort of national revenue model, which is based on resource rents, so revenue from the extraction of resources and selling that, into a model which is more around human resources, where we make full use of human creativity to improve value chains, to improve the design of products to be more durable and to last longer.
And at the same time, contributing to a reduction in climate change, because we're addressing those production cycles. Yeah. Lisa, what about you? I mean, you're working obviously with a number of different projects with New South Wales Circular, and I know that you've got a focus on small business. What are some of the actions that you're sort of suggesting for smaller operators to be part of the transition?
Well, look, I think it's also for businesses to understand, how can they change their own supply chain, and every little bit piece counts. And I think the example we gave before was a small manufacturing company in Western New South Wales, one nurse at St. Vincent's who started that program. So people power, everyone. I mean, we've got enormous opportunity here to look at not just our own purchasing power, but if for those in a business, working in a business or owning a business, I don't think there's a difference. Have a look at the supply chains that you're going through at the moment. Packaging, how can you reduce that? How can you look at sharing and reuse where you can? We're starting to see some really good engagement from councils. So for example, even my council up the road, we've got an opportunity to take back not just your batteries and your paints, but you can take back soft toys, coat hangers. So these categories are growing all the time. I do think that there is a piece here to Tommy's point about regulators and the economics, so the business case of circularity. And the business case for circularity doesn't have to just apply to global or large businesses. It can absolutely apply to SMEs. And that is looking at how we can change those supply chains, share even the packaging, reduce the packaging by talking to your supplier, thinking about new ways of getting your products if you're picking them up. Changing your model, can you look at renting and sharing some of your commodities or your products instead of selling them? And the interesting thing from our perspective is that the business model it's quite positive. I mean, if you've got one item that you were going to sell once, rather if you try to rent it out, whether that's an easel in the arts department, if you're working in that industry or whatever it is, if you can get that component to go back into the community over and over again, your revenue stream out of that and your payback is going to be much higher. So at a micro level, big opportunities here for people to take a really local look at their business and have a think about that, from hairdressers right through to cafes and other businesses. And then at the other end, at the bigger issue, the bigger end of town, I do think there's a piece for our regulators to be really trying to understand more closely the operation of sharing and reuse business models, because the incentives they have at the moment don't really understand sharing and reuse. And so how are we actually going to make sure that we're promoting recycling of water? We're promoting the ability for people to get free energy from the sun, and to keep our water local as well, not just to be pumping it out to sea. How do we reduce vehicles? By encouraging shared mobility, not just with cars, but other mobility forms, bikes and other things. So I think that there's some really exciting opportunities here, but a bit of effort's going to need to go in through economics and business models to value externalities that aren't currently valued, and to demonstrate to our regulators why we need to pretty much open up our markets to the more and more sharing and reuse business models, because they do have a different cash flow. So there's taxation issues we also need to tackle. There's quite a lot of things that we can do, the government can do, to really allow people to sing here and to make more savings and to participate in that part of the economy, that new economy.
Yeah, good points there, Lisa. And we've got some really amazing questions here, but Tommy, do you have a quick couple of words to finish off that section before we go to our audience?
Yes, thank you, because I couldn't agree more with what Lisa said, really, that the circular economy solutions can be small and they can be local. Often when we think about circular economy, we are thinking about this big circle where everything is going through recycling and coming back from the brink of the landfill, coming back into the whole economy. But there's so many small circles, just avoiding can be just one person, not, taking your own container to the shopping so that you don't need plastic packaging, avoiding, reducing, reusing, sharing, and also repairing. These can be very small circles which involve maybe only a few people. They can be local solutions. Why not treating plastic waste more locally? It doesn't have to be in one big facility in the country. There are also really good examples from sharing and refurbishing. So we see that with electronic consumer goods like mobile phones. There is a fair phone, a refurbished phone. You can get that now, and it's equally good to a new phone. Clothes swapping. So there are internet platforms now where people can swap their clothes. And it's very popular with young people. Young people find this cool, and this is good. Yeah. This is where we need to go. We have the Vinnie's model here, where you can bring your secondhand clothes, and this is going really well. I think I'm quite amazed always how well this is actually working. But this is now going to the next level. Internet, online, involving, young people globally. So this is that there are so many small solutions, and they are already successful from a business point of view. If we can, anything we can do to support this will help. So here is what, where we really can work on.
Great. Thanks, Tommy. Thanks, all of you. So we've actually got some good questions here in the chat, and unfortunately, we've got a little bit of a technical issue that we can't upvote the questions, which is unfortunate. So we'll just see how many we can get through in the time that we have here. So the first question up from Anthony. Hi, Anthony. In today's roadmap to net zero emissions, there was no mention of circular economy's potential contribution. What more can be done, do we think, to convince governments of the climate benefit of the CE? And he's got also including recycling. To anyone?
I'll jump in,
Lisa?
quickly. Yeah, look, I'll just jump in quickly to say that excitingly, a lot of the state governments and local governments do understand circular economy. So I think the awareness is growing really quickly. And even if we compare that to, and I'm sure our colleagues here will agree, if we compare that to just 12 months ago, 18 months ago, we're really starting to see it being included in pillars, for example, in investment in New South Wales, within Treasury in New South Wales, in Victoria, in Queensland policy areas. So I think that actually it is there and it is growing. We're also starting to see ESG, circular economy now part of ESG for big businesses and SMEs, if they're looking for that sort of competitive advantage, how they can look at creating as a service components to generate new revenue streams. Circular economy is really popping up there. What more can we do? I think we have to be raising awareness. It's events like this, discussions like this that raise awareness, and for us to pass on that information and get curious about it.
Great response. Thanks, Lisa. We've got another question for you, actually, Lisa, from Kat. Hi, Kat. Can you please describe the regenerative farming practices you mentioned, if you've got some examples of that?
Look, I think a great example is some of the work that's been done in the Bega Valley in New South Wales, where we've got Bega cheese supported by the council there and a number of other really key businesses in the area, looking at how many supply chains they can make local and how they can extract value out of pretty much every single waste stream they get their hands on. So whether that's every part of livestock that's being slaughtered for food production, whether that's replacing fertilizer with organic fertilizer, small scale energy to waste has a role, I think, for pig farming, for example. Taking that high organic waste, converting to energy can save farms, 30,000 of these smaller farms, $30,000 a year on their energy bills. So there's a role for small scale AD there. But I think it's what these communities are looking at is how they can be regenerative by focusing on local, by reducing carbon emissions from transport, understanding the supply chains, and how can they adapt those supply chains to grow jobs locally and to reduce waste.
Great, thanks, Lisa. That's an excellent response. One for Jelmer, also from Kat. What policies do you find have been most effective on driving the circular economy in the Netherlands and or Europe?
I think in the Netherlands, it's been the government setting a clear target to improve circularity up to 2030 and up to 2050. I think in terms of in Europe, really driving the transition to a circular economy, a carbon tax or any kind of carbon pricing, whether it's a carbon tax or emission trading scheme, is very effective. Because if you just looking at the example that we just mentioned around wood-based construction, at the moment a wooden building is slightly more expensive than a building out of conventional construction materials, but the carbon impact is very different if we factor that in. So if we factor sort of the externalities associated with using conventional, the negative externalities of using conventional construction materials, if we factor that in, then immediately the wooden building would be a lot cheaper. That we can do with carbon pricing, because it would work across all industries and it would also sort of trickle down across all these value chains. And in the end, also allow consumers to make, or incentivize consumers to make different decisions. And I think that's another angle to the story, because it's also about human resources. If we use these revenues from a carbon tax to perhaps, on the other hand, reduce the tax on labor, then we also make that transition a lot smoother, because it takes time to repair stuff. And at the moment, it's cheaper to just replace something. But if we just start playing with these sort of policy levers, then we can really make that transition across the board.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Jelmer. We've got one here from Steve, and his question is, the net in net zero emissions implies that there is significant offsetting required for emissions. Will there be sufficient pressure on existing emitters to reduce, or will the focus be on initiatives like circular economy to create offsets? Tommy, what are your thoughts on that with regards to offsetting for emissions?
Yeah, of course, this is a trade-off. Companies can offset their emissions, but only to a certain extent. I think the real pressure will ultimately come probably from the investment community, from banking and financing, because increasingly, if you are still involved with fossil fuel projects further down the line, that is increasingly seen as a financial risk. And so even though offsetting is, of course, possible, and for some industries, it will have to occur for some while, because the transition just cannot happen very quickly. It will have to be kept to a minimum, and I think the pressure will really come from financing, because it will become ultimately too expensive to not actually reduce emissions in real terms.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. I think that's one of the sort of seem to be a somewhat of an inverted commas easy sort of way to address, climate emissions, isn't it? That you can offset. So yeah, that's an interesting response. Thanks, Tommy. There's a question here from Kate. What are some of the best examples of how local government can encourage circular economy and regenerative business as part of their economic development work? And Kate's added, thinking beyond local government role in waste management. Lisa, what's your experience in that?
Oh, look, I think councils are absolutely up for this and in many ways leading, but interestingly, they're not in control of all the levers to make it happen. But I do think that councils are just a phenomenal opportunity to provide services. They've got a finger on the pulse. They understand people's behaviour and patterns. They know what their community want. So I think we're starting to see, I mentioned before, local circular economy hubs, and I just think that's going to grow and grow. There's big opportunities to increase repair bars in the same way that we've got, your Mac shop. You can go to Apple and you can get your Mac fixed in the bar there. We'll start to see repair bars that are a little bit more sophisticated, not just focusing on electronics, but moving into, white goods and kettles and other things. I think we're going to start to see that happen. And I also think that as people start to understand the true value of these materials locked away in them, whether that's, the components we've talked about, rare minerals, or whether it's aluminium, or whether it's gold or silver or silicon or whatever, as the value has started to be more and more understood, we're going to see the private sector running to this, government running to this, and more people being able to extract value with new business models to get these going. So councils are really important. I think they're already reaching out in terms of establishing these circular economy hubs to take away waste, but I do think they're also looking at how they can bring it in. So, for example, what do they do with a lot of the organic waste? It's going to be mandated in New South Wales, for example, and other states in coming years, if not already, in some jurisdictions. Some of that organic waste can stay locally because there's usually, parks and other areas that could benefit from that kind of procurement, keeping that organic waste and converting it. So I think we're starting to see a lot of those types of community farms where there's food available. They're growing organic food. They've got sometimes livestock there rather as well, whether it's chickens or other things. So councils are really tapping into what people want, and that's what people want.
Yeah. Fantastic. And I think there are some great examples, that we've on the ACE Hub. We had a couple of events last month to highlight the Hunter Joint Organisation and Lake Macquarie City Council in terms of what they're doing around circular economy. So there's a lot of good interest and a lot of great work being achieved in that space. So hopefully we'll be able to capture some more of that. Okay, we might take a couple of extra questions from the group here. So Kirsten has said that many of the CE initiatives that she's seen are driven by and are therefore reliant on passionate individuals, often having to, slog hard against systems that are generally stacked against them. How do we scale up and embed those initiatives so that they are not dropped when those individuals move on or burn out, for example? And we see this often in many, sustainability examples, or in this case, circular economy. I wondered, Jelmer, you've seen, a number of different projects, in your work. How have you seen the opportunity for these smaller, really passionate individuals to be able to scale up their projects?
Well, to a large extent, what they're doing is often has a degree of pioneering. They're fighting against certain legislation which is not in favor, not just because intentionally they're against the circular economy, but simply because the legislation was designed in a time when linear economy was the only economy we knew. So they're also the ones that are pioneering discussions with the government around, well, how can we change this to make also circular economy models fit within the legislative framework? I think in terms of accounting, there's so I think what I think is encouraging there is that there's traction across the board. So there's the government, at least also in the Netherlands, is now listening to these arguments. Is also because they have a target. They're constantly in interaction with these pioneering sort of circular economy ventures. But there's also other actors stepping up. Accountants, for example. Realizing that if we build a building in a modular fashion, it has a very high end of life value, because you can simply take it down again and rebuild it somewhere else. But it doesn't fit in the current accounting system that we have. And as a result, banks are not able to finance that building on the basis of a high residual value in the next amount of years from now. So there's all these constraints that we need to work with, and we will need the pioneers to actually bring these to the table and address them.
And I think that leads to what Lisa was mentioning earlier as well around, there's so many elements to this that needs to shift, taxation laws need to shift, speaking about investment. So there's a lot that needs to be achieved. And I don't think any of us are saying that transitioning to a circular economy is an easy one-step approach. It's very much a journey and a pathway, but certainly from the people that we've seen joining us today, there are some passionate individuals who, as a collective can hopefully drive some of these changes. I'm noting that we've got we've still got a few minutes left, but I did want to take one last question for the panel that we've got here. And that is, what makes you optimistic, each of you, for the next 10 years or as we move towards 2030? Tommy, maybe we might start with you.
Okay. Thank you. I find this question always difficult because I see as many things to be pessimistic as being optimistic, and I'm always torn between the two. But on the optimistic note, I do think that investment is now moving in the right direction. Investment is really moving away from carbon. So we see increasingly that fossil fuel projects are not being supported any longer, and that alternative types of projects are being supported by banks and big investment. And this is very encouraging, because this trend will only continue. It will only go further in that direction. As I said before, carbon, either in the own company or in the supply chain, is increasingly seen as risky. And so even if legislation might not be completely where it should be, then we're seeing still movement simply because of economic reasons. The price for producing electricity from renewables, solar and wind, has dropped by so much that it's now really cheaper than any fossil fuel project. And this is really amazing. This was not the situation even 5 years ago when the previous IPCC report was written. This is really new. And this really gets us in the right direction. So this is encouraging.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tommy. And what about you, Lisa? What makes you optimistic as we go towards 2030?
Look, I think the fact that we set targets to cut carbon and we've been cutting it, we need to work harder on this, and some jurisdictions have been slower, some have been faster, but generally we have moved towards cutting carbon. We do need to set targets. I can't stress how important measurement is. We must understand the role of circular economy as well and the opportunities there, set some targets around this, and then it's possible for us to move forward in a way that's meaningful to that end point. Tommy's right. There's a lot here that is very serious and we need to think about, but there is such a big opportunity. And in terms of the circular economy, it really makes sense. It's kind of it's a real opportunity up the sleeves of governments and us all, that we've managed to find some extra carbon that we can cut through our own activities and grow businesses in the same way. So I like that I'm working in the space of circular economy. I think it has to be about our economy. It's got to make sense. We still need to get the things, we still should be able to get the things we need. It's not that we're going to not be able to get those things, but we'll be getting them in different ways and ways that ensure we've got a planet for the future. So my bet is on circular economy. Yeah, that's what I hope everyone can start thinking about moving forward as well.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lisa. And I guess on the final note of a circular economy perspective, Jelmer, what makes you optimistic as we head towards 2030?
For me, it's really the sheer variety of initiatives that are out there. That accountants are now stepping up and saying, well, also here there are barriers to a circular economy which we need to address. I think Tommy referred to the divestment away. So big pension funds decide to no longer invest in say the fossil industries, and I think on the other side, perhaps even at some point, decide to really invest in the circular economy, which has different business models, requires different knowledge, but we're getting there. Yeah. I think another example which I found very intriguing is that in Amsterdam municipality recently decided to ban certain billboards or sort of marketing expressions in the metro. They will no longer advertise or allow advertisements for sort of short flights to holiday destinations nearby, or so certain sort of carbon intensive behavior. Because in a way, when you think about it, it's absurd that you have a metro system where you expose people to incentives or at least exposures around billboards that incentivize them to do something very different. And I think it's all that awareness that is really growing rapidly, and that's also what keeps me going.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Jelmer. Wow, I think we've done pretty well. I think we'll close it there. And look, I just want to say thank you to each of you again. It has been such a privilege to listen to all of you and share and reflect on your learnings and share with us your experience and your knowledge, vast expertise in this really important conversation at this particular time, and particularly for Tommy and Jelmer. We know that COP26 is, you're busy with doing stuff on COP26. So we really appreciate you allocating some time with us this afternoon. And I think what you've all highlighted is that we need to do everything possible that we can to reduce our emissions. But the circular economy really offers a fantastic opportunity for us to reduce that other, 45 or 50% of emissions, aside from what can be done with renewable energy. So, we know that the actions that we take now, and examples of what you've seen since the last IPCC report, Tommy, that you were speaking of, we've seen the shift already. And so we can really keep going and doing a lot more to create these opportunities for future generations. Thank you for everyone at home for joining us. We know that an evening session is sometimes interrupting dinners and getting kids to bed and so on. So thank you very much for allocating this time to be with us. We'll be sending out the link to the recording as well, so you can share that with your networks, and we'll follow up with any of the resources that we've mentioned here tonight in coming days. To find out about any of our upcoming events, you can connect with us, subscribe to our newsletter on the acehub.org.au website. You can also find the recording from here on the website, and as well as other recordings. And you'll soon be able to join us on the ACE Hub collaboration portal, which is really exciting. That'll be our next release in probably about a month or so. So we look forward to meeting you all there. But in the meantime, we want to just highlight as well at Planet Arc, you can learn all you want to learn about reduce, reuse, recycle, repair, repurpose in our National Recycling Week campaign, which is now underway. National Recycling Week is the 8th of November. So there's lots of activity for you to participate in and contribute your piece to a circular economy transition. And so before I wanted to go, I just wanted to say a very big thank you to Maddie and Lucy and the ACE Hub Planet Arc team for pulling this all together tonight. And again, thank you to each of the speakers for sharing your evening or your morning with us in Jelmer's case. For those of us who are we'll close off the session just shortly, but there will be a few questions at the end if you wouldn't mind just responding to those for us so we can get your feedback on what we can look at for next year's event. And I think with that, I would just like to say thank you again for each of our fantastic speakers for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you. It was
Thank
fantastic.
you as well.
Thank you very much.
All right. Take good care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.